Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. My guest today is Lina Khatib, and we will be discussing the renormalization of Syria and Assad into the Arab world. Dr. Lina Khatib is a director of SOAS Middle East Institute and MBI Al-Jaber Chair in Middle East Studies, as well as the Professor of Practice at the Department of Political and International Studies at SOAS University of London. Prior to this, she served as Director of Middle East and North African Program at Chatham House. Before that was Director of Carnegie Middle East Center and Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She is also the co-founder and lead of the Program for Arab Reform and Democracy at Stanford University Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and was a senior associate at the Arab Reform Initiative. She has published several books and is a frequent writer and commentator on current affairs in the Middle East. Lina, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
And it is our great pleasure to have you. And today's topic is obviously something that's, it's been building up for a very long time. But, it was on the 19th or 20th of May, 2023, sorry, I'm missing 10 years, where President Bashar Al-Assad, who is the obviously leader of Syria, was invited to the Arab League summit in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. I'm wondering, Dr. Lina, if you could perhaps talk to us a little bit about the significance of what happened at the Arab League summit and, why did it happen?
Yeah, the Arab League summit that you refer to happened on the 19th of May, 2023. And it was the first time that Assad makes an appearance because Syria had been suspended from the Arab League following the uprising in Syria in 2011 that President Bashar al-Assad and his regime cracked down on with sheer violence and brutality. So this was the first time since then that Bashar al-Assad makes such an appearance. And therefore it was significant. After more than 10 years of isolation at the regional level in the Arab world, there is Assad publicly embraced by the Arab League, particularly Saudi Arabia, because the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was the one to greet Assad, and this was done obviously very publicly. And it sent a very strong signal that this, in a way, long chapter of hoping for regime change in Syria is sadly well and truly over.
Yes, and what was actually discussed at the Arab League summit, and was anything, obviously it's a symbolically very important moment, and symbolically it symbolizes Assad's renormalization and attempts at regime removal, or at least his removal, at least as far as the Arab League states are concerned, is now officially over. But at the conference itself, did anything concrete materialize in any of the other outstanding issues that they have?
I guess it wasn't surprising that the speech that Bashar al-Assad gave at the Arab League summit contained very little substance. It was a speech that could have been given almost at any time, talking about returning to the Arab fold, and as if war had not really happened. He just did not acknowledge any role for himself or his regime in what's been happening in Syria over the last 10 years. In a way, he regarded it as his legitimate right to be re-embraced in the Arab world at the regional level. And here I want to emphasize the regional level because not all Arab countries are welcoming this move. Qatar in particular has been quite reluctant at Syria's readmission into the Arab League. Qatar said that the country will not stand in the way of the Arab League doing so. However, its own bilateral relations with Syria will remain the same, meaning no diplomatic ties between the regime of Bashar al-Assad and Qatar. So that was one significant concrete thing that happened during the summit. The presence of Qatar was largely to appease the host Saudi Arabia and to maintain cordial relations with the region, but the Emir of Qatar was not there. when Bashar al-Assad was giving his speech at the Arab Summit, for example. Other than that, a lot of the so-called conditions that had been discussed prior to the Arab League, that some perhaps were hoping would be in place before Assad is readmitted into the Arab League, none of those conditions actually materialized as conditions. Instead, a number of the issues that had been discussed prior to the Arab League summit were merely presented in the summit as issues for cooperation between the Syrian regime and various countries in the Arab League. And these issues include the refugee file, the detainees file, and also the Captagon trade file, amongst others. So in a way, this was largely a ceremonial event that marked regarding the Assad regime as the winner of the war in Syria and as the legitimate ruler of Syria in Arab eyes.
It's kind of interesting as well. I mean, you mentioned in his speech, he doesn't really acknowledge what's happened in his country for the last 10 years, but this feels like almost typical Bashar al-Assad speeches, because whenever you do look at his speeches, it's very rare for him to acknowledge the challenges happening in his country. I mean, you got a rare acknowledgement in a very indirect way in 2015 that things weren't going very well, but even here it was still very cautious language being used. And of course, there's that famous speech in 2011, as much as you can call it a famous speech, where he when the crisis started to develop in Daraa, he goes up in front of the Arab League Parliament and doesn't really refer to the crisis, the protests happening in Daraa directly, but does allude to the fact that there might be foreign interests involved, and he uses words like fitna, as in sedition, and so on. And so it's as if, like, it's almost a sign of his attempt to project confidence in the sense that, I can deny these events, it didn't happen, almost.
Yeah,
so there's that kind of form.
His style is to be dismissive. He never ever acknowledged that there was an uprising in Syria, for example, from the very beginning. And this is his approach, that he just dismisses what is happening. He only wants his narrative to prevail. And so he has always insisted that whatever challenges were happening in Syria were actually attempts by terrorists to topple his regime, and that all he's doing is try to protect Syria and defend it against terrorists. So he has consistently labeled anyone who stands in opposition to him as a terrorist, and that has not changed. And also blaming mainly the West and foreign hands, vaguely speaking, for crises in Syria and for meddling as well, which of course, even at the Arab League summit, was highly hypocritical, because that's something that he also mentioned in the speech. Basically said Syria should handle its internal affairs without external interference, when Syria right now under the Assad regime is very much completely tied to the regime in Iran as well as Russia. And Iran and Russia are playing a very active hands-on role at the military level, at the political level, and the economic level in Syria. So for him to say no one should meddle in our affairs is hugely farcical.
So we've been hearing a lot about, what Saudi Arabia and the other countries were hoping to gain from all of this. And there's always this sort of almost half wishy-washy thing about maybe moving him away from Iran or whatever. But it doesn't feel like, obviously, that's going to happen. And I'm pretty sure Gulf states themselves know that this isn't going to happen. So what is it they were actually hoping for from all of this?
Yeah, this hope that maybe Assad could be pulled away a little bit from Iran is not realistic. And as you said, no country in the Arab world really believes that will ever happen, at least not in the foreseeable future. And therefore, we have to think actually about Gulf national interests here, especially Saudi national interests. Saudi Arabia is the one that took this big move, King Salman sending the invite to Assad to attend the Arab League summit, is all about Saudi Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia's own national ambitions. It wants to diversify its economy. It wants its socio-economic reforms under Vision 2030 to be successful. And for that to happen, the last thing Saudi Arabia needs is to have tensions in the region. So what Saudi Arabia is trying to do is de-escalate tension in the region. And so this is not really about Syria. It's actually about Saudi Arabia. In a way, whatever happens within Syria is not the concern, as long as this doesn't present a headache at the security level for Saudi Arabia.
Yes, it's interesting because, of course, if you're Saudi Arabia, you do have some advantages here because you don't have refugees to deal with, like, say, Lebanon or Turkey or even the EU. But one area of tension that does exist specifically is over the Captagon trade, which we've alluded to just a moment ago. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what this trade is and why it's important.
So when it comes to the drug trade in Syria, this is sadly nothing new. The drug trade has been going on since before the uprising of 2011. But what has happened over the years is that the war brought with it many profiteers and new actors that have risen to become cronies, warlords, and a lot of them are involved in the drug trade. So the drug trade boomed in Syria during the war. And one of the key actors involved in this drug trade is the 4th Division of the Syrian army, led by the brother of Bashar al-Assad, Maher al-Assad. Now, this division is the one that is leading on the drug trade of Captagon in Syria. Now, Captagon is a drug that is relatively cheap to manufacture. It's a chemical drug. It does not rely on agriculture. It does not need sophisticated labs to be manufactured. And the Captagon trade basically became so big in Syria that Syria came to be known as the Captagon capital of the world. And the Captagon trade is flowing in many directions, and one of those directions is the Gulf. So there have been a number of seizures of Captagon shipments being smuggled to Saudi Arabia through Jordan, amongst other routes. And so Saudi Arabia, of course, would like this Captagon trade to be well put under control and, of course, to just end. But realistically speaking, the Assad regime makes a lot of money from the Captagon trade. And as I said, it's the Assad family that is involved in this trade on a first-hand basis. So they are unlikely to just give up this trade. They might actually perhaps divert some of the shipments away from Saudi Arabia somewhere else, in return for some sort of financial compensation, perhaps under the umbrella of early recovery, for example. It doesn't have to be direct financial compensation from Saudi Arabia. As long as Assad feels that, you know, the regime is getting something in return, he might turn off the tap a little bit. But I don't think that this drug trade is going to completely end, as Saudi Arabia perhaps hopes. The other issue is that the Arab League set up a committee for Syria to cooperate on the Captagon trade with the Arab League. And in this committee, within the Arab League, you have Jordan, you have Iraq, and you have Lebanon as members. Now, militias in Iraq and Hezbollah in Lebanon are very much involved in the Captagon trade as well. So in a way, having these countries be presented as part of the solution also tells us about, you know, the ceremonial nature of this cooperation that the Arab League was talking about on the various issues that really should have been conditions for Syria's return to the Arab League, but are not.
Yes, and this leads to also an interesting question, which is obviously the state of the Syrian economy is just in complete dilapidation. It's been ruined for years, and the cost of reconstruction is astronomical. But obviously the regime is still financing itself in various ways, although it's resorting to more and more desperate measures. So obviously we've just talked about drugs, but I'm also wondering, you know, how else is this regime financially even staying afloat?
I mean, the regime is staying afloat because it's not actually delivering to as many Syrians as it used to deliver to, for example. So when you think about more than 6.5 million Syrians being outside Syria right now as refugees, these are Syrians that the regime does not have to worry about. When you think about towns that are destroyed these are not towns that the regime needs to worry about in terms of the provision of basic services and infrastructure. So in a way, the burden on the regime has in many ways actually lessened in a very perverse and horrible way. Then you have, of course, the Captagon trade that we talked about. We need to clarify here that this money coming in from this trade is not going to the Syrian state budget, and it is not being spent on infrastructure for the people that the regime is still responsible for or trying to provide for. This money is completely outside the state system. It's not going to fund the army. It's not going to fund ministries or municipalities. It's lining the pockets of the cronies and the warlords and those involved in the 4th Division of the Syrian army and the regime circle, basically. So you have money flowing in, but a greater gap than before, I would imagine, between the haves and have-nots in Syria. And so you hear every now and then complaints, even from people in regime areas, that there is a lack of bread sometimes, or a fuel shortage, or services are not available, security is not great, there's high unemployment. And so, yes, the regime is maintaining itself as a regime, but the Syrian people themselves are feeling a big difference, and they are being sacrificed basically so that the regime can maintain its place at the top of the hierarchy in Syria.
It's also interesting to point out as well that when we talk about regime areas, it's really dependent on the area we talk about in terms of who's actually patrolling that area, because of course in large parts of Syria there is no longer, or at least, you know, official representatives of the state in terms of law enforcement, in terms of these other things, either have very minimal or have limited presence in many areas. And really it's militia groups who patrol in some parts of Syria, whereas that's not the case in others. So there's, in a sense, no provision that way, but also it's not the regime directly ruling in some ways, it's militia groups. So talk to us a bit about that dynamic between the militia groups and the regime there.
Yeah, I mean, the war brought with it many militias because the regime needed them after the Syrian army faced a lot of challenges because of defections. As we know, many people left to join opposition groups and rebel groups, or just to flee because they didn't want to fight other Syrians. So the Syrian army's capacity was reduced. And meanwhile, the regime also was fighting an asymmetrical war, and militias are convenient in this kind of setting. Plus, you had Iran in particular funding militias in Syria. Not just Hezbollah coming from Lebanon, but actually some fighters from other places in the world that Iran was training. And all of those militias were fighting alongside the Assad regime, plus forces like the so-called National Defense Forces, which are Syrian, but are considered an auxiliary force to the Syrian army. So they are a militia, but they're regarded as legitimate in their role in so-called national defense in Syria. So with time, of course, and it didn't take a lot of time for these actors, these militias, to see in the war a lucrative economic opportunity. So in many ways, instead of pursuing objectives that were dictated by the regime from the top, they also began to pursue their own objectives, which very often were about profiteering. And when you want to profiteer as a militia, you have to impose your own control over certain areas to be able to engage in extortion or looting or theft or illicit trade, or even legal trade in some cases, but to kind of be the person or entity overseeing any financial transactions in your area. So this resulted in a de facto fragmentation of security provision in Syria as these different militias started pursuing their own individual goals. And of course, over the years, the regime has tried to rein in some of those militias to a certain degree, but the fact remains that the situation right now in Syria under regime control is a mixture of places where you do see some presence for the official Syrian authorities, but in a lot of cases, these militias are still doing their own thing, which is why citizens, even in loyalist areas in Syria, like Latakia, for example, have been every now and then complaining about security because of the behavior of these militias that are de facto controllers in their regions.
Yes, and all of these things we're mentioning complicates a lot of things when it comes to dealing with Syria, because of course now we've got a lot of countries talking about maybe we should deal with Assad again, and maybe half these problems will resolve itself, but it's really hard to see how that would happen. And of course, that came up a lot during the earthquake discourse, where there was a lot of discussions on the internet, especially about aid going to Syria and whether we need the sanctions that the US imposed, which were the 2019 or 18 Caesar Act sanctions, whether that was preventing aid from getting through. But others pointed out that, in fact, even if aid is getting through, the regime just takes a lot of the aid and uses it for whatever it wants to use it for, rather than for the good of its victims. But, and of course, the earthquake was a big moment in which the Assad regime did go throughout the world to say, we do need you to lift some of these sanctions. And so I'm wondering if you could perhaps tell us about that dynamic a little bit.
The regime saw in the earthquake an opportunity to normalize with the international community at large. It knew that even US sanctions would come under scrutiny from people thinking that now is a situation of exception, and therefore some sanctions should be lifted. And the US Department of the Treasury did actually do that. It issued an exception meant for sending resources to Syria for the sake of helping people in the aftermath of the earthquake and for purposes linked to the damage of the earthquake. But this is a temporary easing of sanctions. It's not the same as lifting sanctions completely, which is what Assad was basically hoping to do. But as you pointed out, Assad has persistently painted this erroneous picture that it is Western sanctions that are hurting the Syrian people, when the reality is it is the regime and its behavior that are hurting the Syrian people financially and economically. The sanctions target regime entities in Syria, and they have always had a humanitarian exception anyway. So what we saw with the temporary easing that I talked about in the US is to broaden any financial transaction with Syria to not just be limited to humanitarian aid, but humanitarian aid was always there as an exception, even in US imposed sanctions. And so when it comes to aid, the sanctions were never a hurdle for the distribution of aid anywhere in Syria. But the Syrian regime wanted to be in control of any aid being sent to Syria and to be able to decide where this aid is deployed. And of course, the regime has never acted equitably in this regard. So, even if the international community at large said, okay, Assad can and should receive foreign aid to help the victims of the earthquake, there were no guarantees that Assad was going to make sure that this aid reaches its intended recipients. The diversion of aid has been a very persistent problem in regime-held Syria.
Are we able to actually say then what the impact of sanctions actually were? Because obviously this is something that keeps coming up again and again about how dangerous sanctions are, how they really inhibit people. And I think a lot of people, I think there's a few things going on here. I think people sort of conflate one type of sanction with all types of sanctions. So people think a lot about the 1990s when Iraq was placed under sanctions, and they just apply that to any place that's been sanctioned, where, from what I can tell, sanctions in many ways have become even more targeted since then. But I'm wondering if there's any good way of determining what the actual impact has been on the Syrian economy from these sanctions.
Well, when it comes to the sanctions, you rightly pointed out, there is a big distinction between the sanctions that have been imposed on Iraq, and even before that, Iran, actually, in the 80s and 90s, and the sanctions that are very targeted, that are imposed on Syria and target individuals and organizations and companies linked to the Assad regime. They do not target, the Syrian people at large. And crucially, as I said, the current sanctions have a humanitarian exception. Anyway, when it comes to the regime itself, the regime has been good at evading sanctions. Iraq has been, for example, one of the countries in which the regime has been able to evade sanctions. Lebanon is another country, and there are others. So you have Syrian individuals who can set up companies in these countries and, pretend that they have nothing to do with the regime and conduct business and funnel money to the regime that way. But crucially, when we talk about sanctions, I think, need to realize that sanctions on their own are not sufficient to push any regime to really modify its behavior. Sanctions are one tool. The fact that these are targeted sanctions is a good thing. However, thinking that sanctions alone are going to make Assad suddenly turn democratic or behave in an equitable and fair and just way towards these people are just fantasy. What is needed is a comprehensive policy on part of the West and the international community at large to deal with the problem in Syria, and that has been lacking. And so what we have is people saying, okay, so what is going on? Oh, sanctions. And as you can see, Assad's still there, so sanctions are not working, and they see Syrian people suffering, and so their sanctions are not working. But actually, the reality is, had sanctions been part of a broader package, perhaps we would be seeing a different scenario, and people wouldn't be so fixated on trying to find something to blame for the failure. For me, the key failure lies in the lack of political will in the international community at large, and particularly in the US, to really have regime change in Syria and to bring this conflict to a close and have political transition per UN Security Council Resolution 2254. That has not happened. The UN has been largely impotent in this regard. The US had an opportunity under Obama, under Trump, and even under Biden. But now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the situation has become even more complicated. So I don't really see in the near future or even in the medium term any resolution for this situation in Syria. So yeah, sanctions, I'm not someone who will defend sanctions in a blanket way, but in the case of Syria, I think we need to look at the big picture.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's this horrible tendency in the US right now, and has been for a while, which is we don't like what's going on, but we don't want to do anything. So what can we agree to do? Sanctions become the policy rather than the tool. And I think that's, it's a very bad way of thinking about policy. But I also think, we've been talking about regime change, and I think it's important to sort of clarify that, as far as I can tell, the US has never had a regime change policy in Syria in the last 10 years. I mean, the furthest they ever seem to go, if we go by what they've said in official negotiations and what's been made public, is that, up until, 2016, 2017, the position was Assad should personally step down. And then I think in 2017, they said he should still step down, but he can handpick his successor. So there was this idea that, if the regime completely collapses, it's all chaos, it's Iraq. And so what we want is to maintain some sort of stability, but we want somebody who can maybe integrate the opposition, who's not so toxic and so problematic. And it seems to be that approach that has failed.
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember that President Obama back in the day did say that Assad must go. So when I talk about regime change, there was a very big hint there. And the Syrian people at the time listening to Obama did think that the US was going to take some action to actually remove Assad from power. And removing Assad from power is basically regime change. This is the Assad regime, the regime that calls Syria Assad Syria. And so this is what the US had said at the level of rhetoric. But as you said, first, none of this was translated into action, neither diplomatic nor military. I mean, when I talk about regime change very early on, I'm not implying that the US should have attacked Syria militarily to remove Assad, but there could have been diplomatic steps taken, which were not taken. And then if the US says Assad must go and then does not deliver, this does not just hurt the credibility of Assad, of the US in the eyes of Assad, but also hurts the credibility of the US in the eyes of its allies. So in many ways, the way the US handled the situation, and then this backtracking that you rightly cited, with then changing even the rhetoric to kind of imply something else, all led actors like Saudi Arabia to conclude today that the US is just not going to do anything beyond sanctions, really, when it comes to the Syrian file. The US is not going to do anything about Iran's regional role, and it was left for Saudi Arabia and other Gulf actors to basically handle the situation on their own. And they felt, okay, we have Assad as a reality on the ground. We have Iran as a reality on the ground. Let's try to at least de-escalate so that they don't hurt our national interests, because the ideal scenario is just not going to be achievable anymore.
Yes, and I mean, this also leads back to, we're talking about Saudi Arabia here, but, my impression of Saudi Arabia's policies over the last few years is that, you had, when the Arab Spring broke out, and I think people maybe now don't remember this fully, but there was a general fear that this entire region was about to go under in terms of every regime. And my sort of impression on Syria is that Saudi thought, well, they're not exactly a friend of ours, and we can sort of afford to cut them a little bit, because before the Arab Spring, there was an idea of, regardless of where a regime stood on a particular issue, and even if they weren't officially aligned, there was a sense that each regime existing creates a kind of stable authoritarianism across the region. And part of the reason Saudi takes a different position in 2011 is because it's in response to the fact that there's revolutions going on around them. Syria is, it's really bad in Syria, but also they're not really an ally, so let's just cut them loose.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, you had King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia in power. He never trusted Assad, and rightly so, because let's not forget, in 2005, it was the Assad regime that assassinated Rafiq Hariri in Lebanon. And Rafiq Hariri wasn't just an ally of Saudi Arabia, he was also a Saudi national himself. And that led to the cutting of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Syria, because King Abdullah took that step. Now, there was a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Syria in 2009. But then when the uprising happened in 2011, and it completely turned brutal when Assad cracked down, Saudi Arabia was the first to say, we condemn this bloody violence by the Assad regime, and cut diplomatic ties with Syria. So in many ways, it is not surprising that Saudi Arabia took that step back then, because you have to remember that relations between Saudi Arabia and Syria at that time were not just tense because they didn't like him. There was a very concerted effort by the Assad regime, starting with the assassination of Rafiq Hariri and moving on to the assassination of many leading thinkers and political figures in Lebanon who were standing against Bashar al-Assad's ambitions in Lebanon, who were also killed. And therefore, Saudi Arabia, was, in my view, legitimate in not trusting the Assad regime. And so what we are seeing today, is still part of the big picture, in which, in my view, I don't think Saudi Arabia trusts the Assad regime, and I don't think we should think that Assad's return to the Arab League means that Saudi Arabia is going to forget, even under its new leadership, forget about this legacy. It's just pragmatic on part of Saudi Arabia and others in the Arab League. And as I said, the absence of US support has played a huge role in pushing regional actors towards this pragmatism.
Yes, and it's kind of an interesting one as well, because of course we still have refugees, and they're the other aspect of this thing. I mean, of course, from Saudi's perspective, it's not a major issue. They don't have a pressing concern with it, but Lebanon, Turkey definitely does. And there's this idea that by renormalizing with Assad, we can somehow resolve the refugee crisis, which just seems completely far-fetched. So could you talk to us, why do people believe renormalizing with Assad will somehow resolve the refugee crisis?
I mean, the irony is that the two countries in the Arab world that have the most Syrian refugees, which are Lebanon and Jordan, never actually cut diplomatic ties with Syria after 2011. So these are two countries that always maintained their political relations with Syria. I mean, Jordan may have downgraded a little bit, but it never cut the ties, and Lebanon never even downgraded. And so in a way, you have to think, well, if your bilateral relations were always there, then how come now all of a sudden this situation is going to be favorable to you to get your Syrian refugees out and back into Syria? I mean, so I think in many ways what we are seeing is a piece of theater on the part of the Lebanese government in particular. The Syrian refugee file is being labeled as the cause of almost all of Lebanon's problems right now, in terms of social cohesion, in terms of the economy. The Syrian refugees are being blamed for draining the country's resources and diverting resources away from Lebanese citizens. Now, of course, Lebanon has suffered some economic consequences, of course, because of the Syrian war, but to blame all Lebanon's problems on the refugees is a massive and unfair exaggeration. So what Lebanon is trying to do here is use the refugee file as a way to beg for funding from foreign countries on the basis that, okay, now there's normalization. This means that the refugees can go back to Syria, and let's please get some money to help them go back and to help ourselves in the process. With Jordan, it's a bit of a similar situation. And I would say the same applies to Turkey. So in a way, the refugee file now is being used for political reasons, as well as a way for countries to try to acquire some funding. But realistically speaking, although Lebanon has unfortunately sent thousands of Syrian refugees by force back to Syria, the fact that the country has 1.5 million Syrian refugees means that even if it wants to send, all of them by force, practically it's not going to be possible for Lebanon to do so. And in Turkey, again, Turkey is now trying to say, okay, we're going to build infrastructure in northwest Syria so that refugees in Turkey can go there. But again, you have lots and lots of refugees who have set deep ties in Turkey, and it's not going to be so easy for these refugees to go back. And the Syrian regime, crucially, uses refugee return also to try to use it as an excuse to ask for normalization and for foreign funding and for reconstruction money to flow into Syria in a significant way. So sadly for the refugees, they have become a political card and an economic card in all this.
So I want to now sort of bring us to Russia and Iran, because of course they're the big players in Syria. But I think it's also important to point out for the audience that although they are, together on Syria in a sense, they've always clashed over Syria. There's a rivalry of interests. There's a rivalry of even business interests. So a lot of Syria's profitable industries have been taken up by either Iran or Russia. And of course, we've now had the 2022 invasion of Ukraine from Russia, which makes Russia, in a sense, in a weaker position. So I'm wondering what their position in Syria is like today.
The position today has not actually changed that much, because despite Russia's war on Ukraine, its investment in Syria is actually relatively low, and it has not yet felt the need to sacrifice its presence in Syria to boost its operations in Ukraine. And so Syria remains low-hanging fruit for Russia. a cheap way for Russia to stand up to the West, to have a presence on the Mediterranean, and to exert some influence in the Middle East region and the Med region at large. For Iran, again, Iran is facing a mixture of sanctions, an economic crisis, protests at home, but its presence in Syria goes way back before 2011. Even under the days of Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, even during those days, Iran was there in Syria exercising soft power. And also, let's not forget, Hezbollah in Lebanon always used Syria as a thoroughfare to bring in weapons and resources and to train its people, and Iran also supports Hezbollah. So the relationship between Iran and the Assad regime is a very long-standing one. And we also can say the same about Russia. During the days of the Soviet Union, again, there were very close links between the Syrian army in particular and the Soviet army, and this carried on after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. So we're talking about long-term ties that transformed with the conflict because they became deeper and more extensive. But both of them have set enough roots that I think these roots, as far as Russia and Iran are concerned, are there to stay in the long run. So what might happen is we might see some downgrading on both fronts, the Russian and the Iranian, but not a complete erasure. But as you said, the relationship between Russia and Iran is not one of complete alliance and harmony. There's also competition over influence and competition over resources. But at the same time, it's also a relationship of convenience. And we saw a bit of that play out in the Ukraine context when Iran supplied some drones to Russia in return for Russia supplying military equipment to Iran. And in Syria, there's a kind of division of labor that took place during the height of the military campaign when Russia first joined in 2015 and in the few years that came after, whereby Russia took care of the air campaigns and Iran took care of the ground campaigns with the various militias that it funds. And so, yeah, they may not 100% trust one another, but they currently still need one another and can find different roles for one another in Syria. And yeah, sometimes there have been some tensions over, for example, economic contracts with the Syrian government taking some contracts from Iran, giving them to Russia, etc. But ultimately, they are also being very pragmatic in this context, and they both see in it, something strategic and long-term for themselves, and are not likely to give up on Syria for that reason. So I mentioned what Russia gains, what Iran gains is not just support for Hezbollah, which is essential for Iran, but in general, just increasing its influence in the region is very important, and it's not going to give up on Syria, even if it rolls back its existence. So in a way, Iran and Russia will just have to find ways to coexist in Syria to be able to meet their long-term strategic objectives in the Middle East and the Mediterranean.
Okay, so my last two questions are, is the war in Syria actually over? Because obviously that's a big thing that's coming out with people saying, well, the war's over now, war's over. But, Idlib is still not under Assad control, and it's not clear whether, he would ever get it, because obviously Turkey's there. But even if there wasn't, it's not really clear whether there's interest from his allies to do so. So I'm wondering, is the war actually over?
The war is not over. And when we say war, we have to remember it's not just about active combat and airstrikes every day. First, in northwest Syria, the airstrikes are still happening. People are still being killed by the regime and by Russia. Iranian-backed militias are still engaged in military activities. And then you have the other jihadi groups. Let's not forget, we talked a lot about the Iran and Russia and regime side of the story, but then there's the other Islamist jihadist extremist side of the story, which remains a problem, especially in northern Syria. ISIS, for example, has not vanished either. You have HTS in northwest Syria trying to rebrand itself as a political actor, but then you have other extremist groups that are still active in that region. So war is ongoing. I don't think Turkey is going to give up on the territory that it has practically seized in northern Syria either, mainly because Turkey sees in the Syrian context an opportunity to prevent Kurdish entities from establishing an autonomous region on its border. So having a physical presence on the ground prevents that, and so Turkey is not going to give up on that. And meanwhile, in southern Syria, every now and then, we hear reports of also clashes happening, also because people there are maybe under regime control, but not 100% loyalist either. Plus, when it comes to war, it's not just about fighting. It's when we talk about conflict, we have to think about the kinds of violence that people endure. And it doesn't have to be just through guns. And that is the situation that sadly is happening across Syria. I mentioned the behavior of the rogue militias. People struggling economically, people being persecuted. The Assad regime continues to crack down on anyone who dares speak up. Human rights are not there. So, it's not like Syria has suddenly become a peaceful place. It's not a safe place. It's not a safe place for refugees to return, and it's not even a safe place for a lot of Syrians that are stuck and just having to make do.
Okay, last question. So what is the future of Syria right now? And obviously you had an opposition that wanted, I'm using the opposition in a very broad sense of the term, that wanted changes, and obviously those changes didn't happen. But what is going to happen? What is the future of Syria?
I mean, right now, the future looks very bleak because the hopes that there's going to be regime change, or as the UN calls it, a political process, are vanishing. The opposition are now relegated to just few channels of influence, mainly in Turkey and Qatar. But the European Union is still sympathetic, the US nominally so, but they do not have the leverage anymore to really influence the situation in Syria. I mean, the US could have, but chose not to. We talked about that. So what's left for the Syrian opposition? I think they just are now increasingly going down the accountability route, which I think is important. So even if political change cannot happen in Syria in the foreseeable future, these trials that are happening, in particular in Europe, regarding war crimes and seeing people from the Syrian regime, and actually not just the Syrian regime, but anyone who is charged and convicted of war crime be brought to justice, is a positive development. And I think a lot of attention should be diverted to this cause, because it is a worthy cause. And I would say, hope is not completely lost. I mean, politically, yes, perhaps, but at the level of accountability, I think these efforts are gaining momentum and are likely to grow.
Lina Khatib, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you for the conversation.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.